This is Lesson 24.3, Western Imperialism, 1880 to 1914. How did Western imperialism change after the year 1880? And we've seen this before. We've still got College Board Topic 7.6, New Imperialism, Motivations and Methods. Explain the motivations that led to European imperialism in the period from 1815 to 1914. We've seen this. European nations were driven by economic, political, and cultural motivations in their new imperial ventures in Asia and Africa. And this bears repeating as many times as possible. The search for raw materials and markets for manufactured goods, as well as strategic and nationalistic considerations, drove Europeans to colonize Africa and Asia, even as European colonies in the Americas broke free politically, if not economically. And European imperialists justified overseas expansion and rule by claiming cultural and racial superiority. College Board Topic 7.6 goes on to talk about technology, explain how technological advances enabled European imperialism from 1815 to 1914. The development of advanced weaponry ensured the military advantage of Europeans over colonized areas. And communication and transportation technologies facilitated the creation and expansion of European empires. We've also got College Board Topic 7.7, Imperialism's Global Effects. Explain how European imperialism affected both European and non-European societies. And here are 3 ways. Imperial endeavors significantly affected society, diplomacy, and culture in Europe and created resistance to foreign control abroad. And imperialism created diplomatic tensions among European states that strained alliance systems. And imperial encounters with non-European peoples influenced the styles and subject matter of artists and writers and provoked debate over the acquisition of colonies. And we've got College Board Topic 7.9, Causation in the 19th Century, Perspectives and Political Developments. Explain the influence of nationalist and imperialist movements on European and global stability. A variety of motives and methods led to the intensification of European global control and increased tensions among the great powers. And industrial and technological developments, in other words, the Second Industrial Revolution, facilitated European control of global empires. Places everywhere. Time frame 1880 to 1914. Key people of Western imperialism. You've got Leopold II of Belgium, Cecil Rhodes, Rudyard Kipling, Joseph Conrad, and Henry Morton Stanley. Key concepts of Western imperialism: the Meiji Restoration, white man's burden, the New Imperialism, the Berlin Conference, and the Great Rebellion. Intro. From 1816 to 1880, Europeans engaged in economic expansion around the world. China and Japan were opened, but still nominally politically independent. European powers only controlled about 10% of Africa at this time. Spanish, French, and Italian colonies concentrated on Arab parts of northern Africa. The British had won Cape Town in southern Africa in the Napoleonic Wars. Dutch descendants responded to this by going north on the Great Trek and establishing 2 independent Afrikaner republics. And they did this by pushing back the Zulus and the Xhosas. And these Dutch descendants and the British hated each other. The European presence in the middle of Africa was just along the established trading posts along the coast. The interior was almost unknown to Europeans. From 1880 to 1914, however, economic expansion quickly turned into political empire building. And by the year 1900, 84% of Africa was colonized, and Britain controlled a fourth of the world's land area. These colonial systems were not like the 16th and 17th century colonial systems. The balance of power in Europe was potentially threatened by these systems now, and this expansion brought a lot of war and death with it. Competition between European powers led to numerous diplomatic crises. The scramble for Africa after 1880. The scramble for Africa involved 5 main powers: Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and Italy. And these countries made massive efforts to possess as much of Africa as they possibly could. By 1900, 20 years later, they had carved up almost the entire continent. Only 2 countries in Africa remained independent. Ethiopia had successfully fought off the Italians, and Liberia remained independent under U.S. protection. The British had occupied the government of Egypt in 1882. The justification for this had been Egypt's financial default. But this also became a model for later African conquests. King Leopold II of Belgium led the scramble for Africa with an early vision of European possibilities. In the year 1861, before he was even king, he made this observation: if you have access to water and you have steam power, you can basically go anywhere and do anything you want to do in Africa. And Leopold II went for the unclaimed, technically Portuguese middle of Africa, the Congo. He hired journalist, author, and explorer Henry M. Stanley to establish his rule over the Congo. Stanley had already displayed a callous attitude for Africa and its people in previous expeditions. But he explored the Congo River, claimed it for Belgium, forced unfair trade agreements on the people, and established a deadly virtual slave state for Leopold II. And this slave state was called, ironically, for publicity, the Congo Free State. This Congo Free State produced huge amounts of rubber for Leopold II, collected at the expense of millions of African lives. Rubber was in great demand for European factories. And Leopold II and Stanley showed that European imperialism could go deep into Africa with technical superiority and determination. France became alarmed at Belgium's success, so they scrambled to establish their own colony on the north side of the Congo. They had indigenous people sign what they called protection treaties. Sounds a bit mafia-like to me. Belgium's economic gain in rubber caused a gold rush mentality toward Africa throughout Europe. Such gains in raw materials by a neighbor had to be countered. The ramifications of such gains were that one nation might have an unfair economic and military advantage over the others. So numerous other countries started scrambling as well. The big question: how does all of this affect the balance of power in Europe? Well, this is involving weapons and soldiers and boundaries and dynamic expansion. What if one power comes to dominate the entire continent of Africa with all of its precious raw materials? Would they not become powerful enough to dominate all of Europe as well? A balance of power had to be established in Africa, just like there was in Europe, or there could be major trouble. Ground rules had to be established before somebody winds up in a war that could reach back to Europe itself. So, from 1884 to 1885, the Berlin Conference was held. All the Western powers attended, including the United States, and not one single African was represented. In the conference, Africa was divided up among the various European powers according to economic factors like rivers and raw materials and mining claims, etc. No regard at all was given to the rights, desires, or needs of the people living there. The major rule that was established at the Berlin Conference was called effective occupation. And this meant that you had to establish a strong presence in a territory that you claim in order for it to be recognized as yours by the other European powers. And such a precedent meant that European powers had to hurry to get as many assets into Africa and as quickly as possible in order to establish this recognition. The balance of power in Africa was at stake, so it became a race for international recognition of everyone's claims. European powers encountered much resistance in Africa. For example, the British fought all-out wars with both Afrikaner republics for control of gold and diamond mining areas. The Germans fought wars against open rebellion in their East African territory. European powers, however, consistently won these conflicts. And when European forces encountered each other in the field, these crises were resolved peacefully. There was an incident in Fashoda, which we will learn more about soon, in Sudan, where British and French forces almost fought, but the French backed down and left the area. Imperialism in Asia. Where is the Netherlands in all of this? Well, they were busy exerting their control over all of Indonesia. Some of this territory had to be partitioned with Britain and Germany. Where's Russia in all of this? Well, they're conquering Muslim areas in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. The USSR would eventually become the fourth largest Muslim country in the world. And they were also moving in on China's outlying provinces. Where's the United States in all of this? Well, the U.S. acquired the Philippines from Spain in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War. And they promised the people of the Philippines independence, but later changed their minds. And now they were fighting a long, bitter struggle against a big revolt. Causes of the new imperialism. Keep in mind that imperialism was just one aspect of two much more significant expansions. Number one, industry, and number two, nationalism, bolstered by social Darwinism. First, economic motives for the new imperialism. Tariffs were a main factor. Tariffs protected other industrialized countries' industries. And Great Britain was beginning to seriously lose its global market share to these other industrialized countries. And so Great Britain feared that other countries might grab colonies around the world and extend their tariff policies to these new colonies, and Britain would then really start to lose out on the global market. So the solution was start grabbing as much territory as you can before these other guys get it. This motive can be easily overstated. These colonies, they didn't have much money to buy stuff in the first place. So economic motives may not have been as important as other motives. National security. This motive is why even the poorest territory was highly prized. Far-flung holdings provided safe harbors and coaling stations for navies. Some colonies buffered more important colonies. For example, the British needed to protect the Suez Canal, so they controlled Egypt partly to help them protect that canal. They also fought hard to conquer Sudan in order to protect Egypt from the south, in order to protect the canal. The historical argument for imperialism was this: powerful nations always have colonies. And this was driven by two things. Number one, nationalism. Colonies mean that your nation is strong and powerful. Look at history. Every great power had great colonies. Countries that didn't have great colonies were loser countries. And number two, social Darwinism. Strong nations have always conquered weaker nations. Strongest equals best. The victory of the fittest is nature's law, and conquering inferior people is right and just according to nature's law. Technological and military superiority. The British had the Maxim machine gun, and with this gun you could mow down lots of people in one sweep. Number two, the English had the breech-loading rifle. This greatly increased the speed of firing. They also had the mini ball. It's a spinning bullet fired through a rifled musket. It went faster, straighter, and farther. Imperialists also had a drug called quinine, and this allowed conquering white people to withstand the effects of malaria. Lastly, steamships and telegraphs. Telegraphs helped empires concentrate and coordinate their firepower. Easing domestic social tensions and conflicts. You could use colonial issues to distract your own people, and you could divert attention from the class struggle at home. You can create a false sense of national security. Colonies provide essential raw materials. Colonies benefited workers by providing jobs. Colonies raised the standard of living. Special interest groups had their own agendas. For example, European settlers. They wanted more land, and they wanted military protection. Number two, you had missionaries and humanitarians. They wanted to teach Christianity, and they wanted to end the slave trade. Third, you have shipping companies. They want more traffic and more trade, and they wanted government subsidies that protected their businesses. And fourth, colonial officials and soldiers. They wanted opportunities for advancement. They wanted highly paid positions. A civilizing mission. Westerners had a sense of obligation to civilize more primitive, non-white peoples, and many of them subscribed to the white man's burden ideology. White Man's Burden was a popular poem by Rudyard Kipling. And the idea behind the white man's burden is this: the white people are burdened with this long, difficult, thankless task of developing the half-devil, half-child peoples of the undeveloped world. Somebody has to do it, and since white people are obviously the best, it has to fall to them. Imperialism protects vulnerable people. It protects them from tribal warfare and oppression, and it protects them from cruder forms of white exploitation. Women played an important role. Many went as missionaries, teachers, etc., and many people hoped that the presence of these women in these colonies would decrease race mixing. Imperialism facilitated the spread of Christianity. Missionaries were both Catholic and Protestant, and missionaries competed with Islam and other Eastern religions. Orientalism. This idea said that Western people viewed non-Western cultures with a combination of three things: stereotyping, racism, and fascination. The term and description was coined by Edward Said in the 1970s. He argued that Westerners can't look at non-Western cultures without stereotyping, which sounds like stereotyping to me. But are non-Western cultures any more objective when looking at Western cultures? Orientalism was expressed in the media, in novels of romance and high adventure, in paintings of ferocious warriors and slave markets and harems. And this helped spread a sense of Western superiority. Westerners of all classes and occupations are eager to adopt an us versus them view of foreigners. West is rational, non-West is emotional. West is Christian, non-West is pagan or Islam. Non-West is radically other. Non-West is mysterious and romantic and exotic. Critics of imperialism. First, we have J.A. Hobson. He was angered by British tactics during the Boer Wars in South Africa, and he wrote a book called Imperialism. And in this book, he argued that imperialism only benefited the rich. It did absolutely nothing for ordinary English taxpayers, and it did absolutely nothing for indigenous peoples. He argued that imperialism took the people's attention off of domestic reforms where it belonged. And he identified social Darwinism as a driving force in imperialism. Vladimir Lenin. Lenin viewed imperialism as the highest, in other words, final stage of advanced capitalism. To him, imperialism signaled the impending demise of capitalist society. Joseph Conrad. He wrote a book that you may have already read, or you probably will read it while you're still in high school, called Heart of Darkness. This book told the story of a boat captain who was sent up the Congo River to retrieve a Belgian commander who had lost his mind and was doing all kinds of horrible things. And the book describes the degradation and the insanity of the area at the hands of the Belgians in vivid detail. In the 1970s, film director Francis Ford Coppola used the book Heart of Darkness as the basis for his Vietnam War movie Apocalypse Now, if you've seen that. And if you've seen Brad Pitt's recent science fiction movie, Ad Astra, that's Heart of Darkness in space. So Joseph Conrad's warning that we civilized people take our insanity with us wherever we go and impact the world with it still speaks to us. Many critics charged the West with a double standard. Sure, domestically, Europeans were working for representation and democracy and liberty and equality and freedom and social welfare. But abroad, Europeans were working for just the opposite. They were working for a dictatorship and slavery and exploitation.